It is a real privilege to introduce Richard, who I've known for quite a few years, mainly not for the military. I'm afraid I'm not from that background at all. But I used to play tennis with Richard's sons and daughter, and occasionally with Richard, I think, at his in-laws in one of the parishes where I was vicar. And that's how I got to know Richard. I'd like to share, I think, really one great thing about a good leader is somebody who cares not just about the big wigs in the army, but also about the smaller, less important, but vital part of the army. And just if I may share one incident where it shows Richard's, I think, greatness as a leader, was that we had a neighbor who was just a private. She was I think in the catering part of the army, and she had leukemia. She's only about 20, 21. And she was really depressed, didn't know what the future held. And I thought, I know Richard is so humble. He wouldn't mind coming to visit her in her home. And that didn't work out because of logistics. But he did write to her, and it really boosted her. And I think that just shows the sort of quality of good leadership, that they care, not just, they care about the small and the not so important. It reminds me a bit of Christ and the way he cared for the poor and the woman who was either caught in adultery or whatever, who wasn't so important. But Richard, it's such an honor to welcome you, and Richard's got many roles, and his wife is now the Lord Lieutenant of Norfolk, and he supports her in that, amongst many other things. He has 10 grandchildren, and he's an amazing guy. So let's welcome Richard.
Right. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for... I'll keep talking until we get that sort of about right. Thank you very much for inviting me to come. It's a great pleasure to be here. I know we'd hoped to have this occasion in July, but that week I got the dread ping, so I got confined to barracks for a week, and so we had to postpone until today. But it's a great pleasure, always a great pleasure to come to Cromer. It's such a special seaside town, which always fills so many people with so many happy memories. So it's great to be here. And thank you, John and your team, for a delicious breakfast this morning. An army marches on its stomach, so I think I'm going to march well today. In fact, I already feel sufficiently fortified to go to Carrow Road this afternoon and watch Norwich take 3 points off Watford. We've got to get the season going at some stage. And Jess, thank you for your very warm introduction. Yes, we did play together, and my children played tennis with Jess. Jess was the local vicar, and none of us are perfect, and sometimes Jess would miss the ball. And of course, you might say something that your mother wouldn't have liked you to say, but Jess used to say, "Oh, blow." So in our family, Jess is known as "Oh, blow Jess." But now, my remit is to talk about leadership this morning, something that's been very familiar to me during my professional life, and remains so. As you said, a number of things I do. I currently chair the board of the National Emergencies Trust, which was formed in 2019 as a response to the Manchester Arena bombing and the Grenfell Tower fire, that tragedy, and now obviously deeply involved with the nation's response to the COVID pandemic. And that's been an interesting leadership challenge in recent times. So I'm not going to address my subject of leadership entirely from a military perspective, although inevitably many of the thoughts and beliefs and values of the army have been shaped by the 40 years that I was a soldier. So I'll talk this morning under the title of Leadership in Turbulent Times, and I've given myself the subtitle of Faith in Action. And I'll put some ideas out over the next 25 minutes or so, and then I'm very happy to take questions on anything that I've said, or you hoped I might say, so we can start a bit of a conversation. Now, that said, on a personal basis, things could have been very different at the outset of my career, as in my last year at school, those older and wiser than me thought that the army wasn't the thing that I should do, although it was what I hankered after doing, that I should apply to Cambridge, read law, and be a barrister. I suppose I was a moderately compliant young man, so I went along with that and was quite surprised, but pleased, I suppose, to be called for interview to Emmanuel College, Cambridge. And someone said, one question you're bound to be asked is, do you do any law reading? And a really good answer to give is, yes, I read the law reports in the Times. Well, the interview was going quite well, actually, I thought, and then the question came, do you do any law reading? Yes, sir, I heard myself say, I read the law reports in the Times. And I thought, good answer. What cases recently have interested you? Oh, well, this was the late 1960s, and you only had to be vaguely news aware of the Bodies on the Moor trial. Well, as quickly as I could, I said, the Bodies on the Moor trial, and I thought, that's a good answer. And what about that case have you found particularly interesting? Oh, I thought we're getting quite below the belt here. As quickly as I could, I said, well, the fact that criminals got away with it for so long. And he looked over his half glasses at me and said, I think, Mr. Dannatt, you might be better suited to joining the police force than reading law in this college. So anyway, it was to Sandhurst that I went rather than Cambridge, and I joined the army, which was what I really hankered after doing. So within the context of this morning's theme, leadership in turbulent times, faith in action, I had 40 years on and off the front line trying to do, as we all did, some good in the complex and turbulent world in which we live. And my 40 years divided itself fairly naturally into four decades, each of which actually had a very different characteristic. My first decade, the 1970s, was dominated by service in Northern Ireland. At the time, the violence there was very deep-seated and apparently intractable. And it's worth remembering, tragically, that in 1972 alone, the British Army lost 102 soldiers killed in Northern Ireland, more in any one year than the worst of the years of Iraq and Afghanistan combined. And amongst my contemporaries, it was not unusual that 1977 was the only year in that decade that I didn't serve in the province. My second decade was the 1980s, which was the last decade of the Cold War. And my wife and I spent the first 2 years of our married life in Berlin. A lot of people, younger people, don't remember that Berlin was 100 kilometres behind the Iron Curtain, that divide between East and West. But the 1980s was also the decade that included the Falklands conflict. And I believe the two are linked, actually. It was not lost, I believe, on the Kremlin that what they thought was a rather soft Northern European country was nevertheless prepared to send a task force 8,000 miles to the South Atlantic, fight and win a bloody campaign, not in months and years, but in days and weeks, all for some very important principles, like self-determination. And my third decade, the 1990s, began really in the dust of the Berlin Wall falling, where we quickly found ourselves in the dust of the Kuwait Desert in the first Gulf War. However, the new world order that promised so much did not last long, taking the British Army in the 1990s into Bosnia and Kosovo. And then my fourth decade began, very predictably, with the attacks in New York and Washington on 9/11, 2001, just 20 years ago, propelling the British Army, as it did, back into Iraq and Afghanistan, places well known to my grandfather and great-uncle's generation, but really not known to my generation, hardly at all. And in the decades since I left the army, it seems to me that our world's become even more complex, whether it's financial complexity, political complexity, Brexit complexity, thank goodness we're through all that now, and now the social and economic upheaval brought by the COVID-19 pandemic. But it's within this complex environment that there is a growing need for leadership, as people and communities struggle to make sense of the world around them, trying to make sense of the issues facing them, and asking the question, what do we do now? And I think if leadership is to be of any real value, if leaders are to really earn their pay, then it's in turbulent times like today that their real qualities will out, where the real value will be added, and not when everything is going swimmingly and according to plan. So I'd suggest that leadership is for turbulent times, and such times are the context in which effective leaders should thrive. After all, where in the history books would Winston Churchill have sat without the threat of National Socialism, the Nazis, in 1940? Or where would Margaret Thatcher have sat without the challenge from Argentina in 1982. Of course, not only do we recognise that leadership is an important subject, I suspect we can also agree that it's quite a difficult area. After all, discussion has long raged as to whether leaders are born or made, and if they're made, how is it done? What qualities and characteristics should they exhibit? But whether leadership is gifted or acquired, perhaps it's more useful to consider what leaders actually do or try to do. Not surprisingly, and as I've already suggested, I first came across leadership as a subject to be studied formally while I was a cadet at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. And leadership was treated differently to other subjects we studied. For leadership discussions, we didn't sit in sort of classrooms, but we sat around in armchairs in the company bar, rather like we are sitting around now, informally. And we were asked for our ideas, as opposed to just being told what to do or what to think. And I believe that immediately sets leadership apart. It's a personal thing, it's an individual thing, it's an intuitive thing. But despite that, I don't go as far as to subscribe to the notion that leaders are born, not made. Yes, of course, a bit of natural leadership ability helps, but if someone has any leadership ability, then thinking about the subject, studying the subject, experimenting, modelling yourself on a leader you respect, I think all those things can really pay dividends. But when we sat in our armchairs at Sandhurst, we had a range of what we thought were fairly erudite discussions. On the one hand, listing the qualities of a leader, and on the other hand, debating the merits of more functional approaches to leadership technique. I recall an extensive discussion about the thoughts of a former head of the army, the late Field Marshal Lord Harding, and he'd produced an impressive list of the qualities which, in his view, he thought it should be exhibited by a good leader. He said a good leader needed absolute fitness, complete integrity, enduring courage, daring initiative, and undaunted willpower. And interestingly, he stressed the adjectives as well as the nouns: absolute fitness, complete integrity, enduring courage, daring initiative, and undaunted willpower. And to these he added 3 other prerequisites: knowledge, judgment, and team spirit. Now, you're probably thinking, all that's good stuff from a soldier's perspective, certainly applicable, as I would say, in the battle space. But I suggest and would argue probably equally applicable in the business space, the community space, and elsewhere. But as respected and useful as possession of a large number of key qualities is, our discussions at Sandhurst also turned to other ways of thinking about leadership. At that time, Professor John Adair had developed what he called action-centered leadership, which he illustrated with a classic 3 balls Venn diagram. And his model required the identification of the need to blend the task, identifying and achieving the task, what you actually had to do, then maximising the efforts of the team, and most critically, looking after the interests of the individuals. So task, team, and individuals. And put those 3 things together in a simple construct. That all made quite a lot of sense to us. But now, while a dry debate about the merits of a qualities approach to leadership or functional approaches is interesting, if you like that kind of thing, it does remain essentially theoretical, and by definition, not necessarily that useful. But I think a more important question that roots the discussion rather more is to analyse what it is a leader is actually trying to do. And to answer that, I suggest there's a need to have an understanding of what level of activity the leader is trying to lead within and to lead at. In my sphere of work in the army, we separate out 3 levels: the strategic, the operational, and the tactical. Now, the first and the last of those, I think, are well known. The strategic level is where the big thoughts are thought, and every business endeavour or large organisation always seems to be well supplied with strategic thought. Strategies for this, strategies for that, probably too many strategies. And then down below, where it all happens, is tactics, where the rubber hits the road. In this sense, it's all about getting it done, delivery. It is widely held that 20% of an enterprise is about strategy, and the other 80% is delivery, getting it done. And critically, the glue that could be argued that holds it all together is communication. Successfully communicating the big idea to those who have to make it happen. And I think if communication is delivered by leaders or managers who know their staff, who can inspire their staff, and who can drive through to their objectives, then this is probably another commendable formula. But as far as I'm concerned, this overlooks the key level of activity, That's this operational level which sits between the strategy and the tactical, which is the level that sits between the ideas and the action. And I think it's the level that turns the ideas into action. And as far as I'm concerned, it's the level which lifts the mediocre to the exceptional. It's the level, if you like, that lifted Nelson, Wellington, and Montgomery into the history books, and the likes of Bill Gates or Richard Branson into the world's rich lists. Because it's at the operational level where the general or the captain of industry does his real work, where an end-to-end plan is formulated to transform the original idea, the big idea, into success on the battlefield, or in business terms, to a serious profit on the balance sheet. And it requires an understanding and intellectual rigor to do this, to devise a plan, a campaign plan, to take one in a series of steps, which we in the army would call battles or engagements, to the pre-identified end state, and on to success in the campaign. But the compilation of the plan is nothing without the application of energy, drive, and inspiration to take the team on the journey. And this aspect of leadership is key, but it begs the question, will those who are integral to your plan actually come on the journey with you? Because leadership is one thing, but successfully promoting followership is quite another. And to arrive with no one behind you is a very lonely experience. Many a young officer has been followed merely out of curiosity. But then the question is how to do all this? Well, in my organisation, and this is where I am a victim of my own experience, we exercise leadership through something that we call mission command. We aim to do this both in barracks, in training, and in the field and operations. But I'd apply the principle more widely still. Now, that said, in a general sense, I've already touched on the key elements of this. But essentially there are three components to what we call mission command, and they all hinge around this person, the leader. And first, the commander, the senior manager, the leader, needs to think through his problem and convert his strategic goals into the front end of his operational or campaign plan. And this results in him clearly setting out and explaining his intent, his purpose. He needs to have applied sufficient analysis and mental rigour so he can set out to his subordinates or his employees his statement of what needs to be done and his overall intentions as to how it's to be done. This, I suggested, rather more than just a wishy-washy statement on the company office wall. The second stage, in a non-prescriptive way, is to separate out the tasks that need to be done and delegate them to subordinates along with the necessary manpower, equipment and finance to carry out those tasks. But crucially, the leader doesn't tell them what to do, he tells them what they're to achieve. So this is very much an output or an outcome-focused process. And finally, in this section, this is where the process can go wrong. Having delegated the tasks appropriately, the leader needs to supervise the execution of those tasks, not in a way that stifles the initiative of the subordinates to whom the tasks have been delegated, but in a subtle way, always remembering that while tasks can be delegated, responsibility can never be delegated. The buck always stops with the boss. Actually, without going down a rabbit hole unduly, I think this idea of the relationship of ownership of a plan and responsibility for it and its consequences came home to me most starkly in July 2000 when I gave evidence for the prosecution at the trial of one Radovan Krstić before the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague. General Krstić had commanded the Drina Corps of the Bosnian Serb army at the time of the capture of Srebrenica and the subsequent massacre in eastern Bosnia in July 1995. He was about the same age as me, had a professional military background in the Yugoslav National Army that had begun at much the same time as mine had in the British Army. And in 1995 was commanding a formation of the Bosnian Serb army very similar to the 3rd UK Division, which I was then commanding. His mistake on the 13th of July 1995 was to accept a mission from his superior and develop a plan that led directly to the massacre of between 7,000 and 8,000 Muslim men and boys. He accepted ownership of the operation. He therefore became responsible for the plan and mistakenly tried to base his defence in court on having delegated his responsibility. And he was quite properly convicted and sentenced to 42 years imprisonment for a variety of war crimes. But when we say glibly, the buck stops here. For Radovan Krstić, it stopped for him in spades on the day he was convicted. And that said, as an aside to my aside, I know, he knows, and the court also knows, and you could see it in his demeanour in the dock, his realisation that his real failure was the complete collapse of personal moral courage. Had he refused to accept the mission from his boss, General Ratko Mladic, or talked his superior out of the idea, and they'd been at the War College together, they were friends, then he would not be in prison now, and upwards of 8,000 people would still be alive. Okay, the risks of the morally correct line were obviously high, and on the day he failed the test. Now, just changing tack slightly. Viscount Hambledon, who founded the W.H. Smith business empire many decades ago, also had much to say on leadership. And one of his key contentions was that character and integrity are as important in a manager or leader as capability. Character and integrity are as important in a leader as capability, what you can do. And I sense that I've already touched on both aspects of character and integrity in what I've said so far. Yes, a leader does indeed need certain qualities, of which integrity is key. And at the same time, there are certain capabilities that a leader needs to do well, to understand the objectives, to map out this route from strategic end state to tactical decisions, and above all, to communicate his intent clearly, while delegating responsibly, but remembering that he can never delegate responsibility. But I wonder if these qualities and capabilities that I've suggested are enough. Fitness, integrity, courage, initiative, willpower, we've talked about that. These things and more are really important, but are they enough? Indeed, the British Army, which it was my privilege to lead for 3 years until August 2009, we identified for ourselves 6 core values which are at the heart of the ethos of the Army. And these values define us and what we do. Indeed, they're so important that we now educate our soldiers formally in those core values. Actually, values that in a previous generation they may well have picked up in their family or in their wider community, but we can't make that assumption today. But I wonder even if these 6 core values, selfless commitment, courage, discipline, integrity, loyalty, and respect for others, and that one's really important, respect for others, I wonder if they themselves are enough. Well, my own feeling is that a range of leadership qualities and those core values provide a very sound moral baseline, a baseline that makes sense to a lot of people. But the next question is whether a sound moral baseline is enough. Should there not also be a spiritual dimension to this? Well, I believe that there should. And of course, it's the word believe or belief that's at the heart of any spiritual dimension. For some, a belief in the cause, belief in the leader, or even in my organisation within the tribal nature of the British Army, belief in the regiment, or maybe if you support Norwich City Football Club, belief in the Canaries, maybe that will be enough. But I'm not so sure. What really sustains, in my view, is something more than this, something far bigger than ourselves, something bigger and deeper than we can imagine or rationalise for ourselves. Actually, this first came home to me as a young platoon commander in Belfast in the early 1970s. My platoon of some 30 soldiers and I got caught up one particular day in a vicious and protracted gunfight that lasted several hours. At the end of the day, at least 2 gunmen and one of my soldiers had been killed. And although we didn't admit it to each other, we'd all been seriously frightened at some stage or another during that day. And that experience told me, and it's been shared by many in Iraq and Afghanistan in recent times, that even the toughest of men, when the chips are down and the reality of life and death confronts, then people are reaching out into the spiritual dimension, beyond the rational and beyond the moral. And actually, if you think about it, as we sit here this morning, there may well be British soldiers on operations not now in Iraq or Afghanistan, but in other parts of the world, laying their lives on the line on behalf of our nation, Mali in Africa being one place. At this moment, it's very likely that someone may be facing the issue of life and death, making an instant decision about who lives and who dies. And soldiers know better than anybody else the close proximity of death in battle and the yearning for life itself. When death confronts, then the bigger issues of life become very clear. After all, none of us knows when death will confront us. The only certainty in life, of course, is that one day it will. I read this account a few years ago of a young soldier who had just shot his first enemy fighter in Afghanistan. He wrote this. Afterwards I sat there and I thought, hang on, I just shot someone. I had a brew in that. I didn't get to sleep that night. I just lay there all night thinking, I shot someone. It's something strange, a really strange feeling. You feel like, you're happy with yourself. I've done my job, it's what I've come here for. Know what I mean? He's Taliban and I got one of them. You feel quite chuffed about it. Then you're feeling like, sad. You're thinking, the geezer's another human being at the end of the day, like. Then you get the feeling, well, it was either him or me. And then you're thinking, I think people get like, religious then as well. You're thinking, well, in the bigger picture, if there is like a geezer up there and a geezer downstairs, what's that mean for me now I've just shot someone? Is that me done for? Am I going to hell or what? And all of that went through my mind that night for hour after hour after hour. It's often said there are no atheists in a foxhole, and none of us knows when we're going to meet our Maker. But if there is a geezer up there and a geezer downstairs, I'm absolutely certain that I know which of the two that I would like to meet, and that's the God of love and hope up there. But I don't think this just applies to armies in a combat situation. I think there's an application to any situation of pressure, stress, or challenge when individuals are stretched to their physical or psychological limits. Where do you go to when you've lost your job, or your firm has gone bust, or your investments are now worthless, let alone when your comrade is shot dead beside you, or a close family member or friend has lost their life to COVID-19? And I think the truly effective leader needs to recognise this question. But he or she is, of course, personally challenged to provide what is needed, especially if he does not have some empathy with or some experience of a spiritual dimension to one's own life, oneself. Where does the leader go to provide the strength and guidance for those for whom he or she is responsible? So this is very much a personal thing. But any of us in these difficult circumstances should remember we're not the first to have trodden this path. One aspect of leadership development, accepting that others have trod where we now step, is the identification and deliberate modelling on someone that we really respect as a leader. In my experience, a number of people left a lasting impression on me. I can recall a brigade commander, a brigadier, a wonderful man, but with a fearsome temper. Some people have a short fuse, he had no fuse at all, which had the effect of, when he went off on one, really scaring the younger officers, such that their performance absolutely nosedived. But I also recall a brilliant battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel, again with a fearsome reputation. But with him, if you made a mistake, he would take time to explain, teach, and encourage you to get it right next time. However, a repeat of that mistake was probably best avoided. But if we're lifting the discussion to a spiritual dimension, then there is one obvious role model to look at as far as I'm concerned, and that's to look at the person and example of Christ himself. Christians, quite rightly, put huge emphasis on the death and resurrection of Christ, but his life also provides the model that I believe leaders will do well to try to emulate. As it happens, the motto of the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst is serve to lead. I think that Christ in his lifetime is a very clear example of that maxim. When Christ washed his disciples' feet on that first Maundy Thursday evening, he was doing the most menial and humble task. And by serving his disciples, he was earning the right to lead them. He would ask of others nothing that he would not do for himself. He would not do himself. And his style of leadership, it was to say quite simply, follow me. It was not said in a macho way, but it was said in a way that gave people the opportunity to look at him, to look at what he stood for, to look at what he promised, and to decide for themselves whether to follow him or not. And this is key, since, as I've already said, the flip side of leadership is followship, and the real trick of being a successful leader is to make people out of their own free choice follow, not out of curiosity, but out of belief and confidence that the direction of travel is right and that the objective is worth the cost along the way. Following his Father's plan and doing what he had to do cost Jesus Christ his life, but his belief and confidence in his Father's plan led to him opening up the way to peace and purpose in this life and life beyond for those who are also prepared to put their trust in him. In my former business, asking people to risk their lives is part of the job, but doing so without giving them the chance to understand the meaning of life and death, I believe, is something of a dereliction of our wider duty of care to our people. Therefore, I think there's very much an obligation on the leader, certainly on a Christian leader, to include a spiritual dimension into his people's general conduct of their lives, and in my case, their preparation for potentially life-challenging operations. Yes, qualities and core values are fine as a universally acceptable moral baseline for leadership, but the unique life, death, resurrection, and promises of Christ provide that spiritual opportunity that I believe takes the privilege and the demand of leadership to another level. But if a leader, or indeed a follower, is going to take that privilege and demand to that higher level, then I believe we need to be properly equipped for that. And as a military man, I would say that we need a personal concept of operations, a framework for one's own life to make sense of the turbulent times around us. And I suggest we need to consider three things, and they're tough actually. We need to ask ourselves whether we're prepared to be obedient to God, committed to Christ, and open to the Holy Spirit. Time is pressing, so just a couple of thoughts on those three propositions. Obedience to God. If you know your Bible well, consider the well-known story of Gideon in Judges chapters 6 to 8. On God's instructions, Gideon, despite being faced by a huge tactical problem, reduced his army from 22,000 to 10,000 and finally just to 300 men. On God's instructions, he endorsed an amazing concept of operations, deploying his tiny force at night, equipped more like the regimental band and the quartermaster's department than crack troops. The result was that 135,000 Midianites were defeated. This was a fantastic victory stemming from obedience to God. And I could quote so many other examples. But listening to God and doing what he prompts you to do is the baseline. Again, remember the boy Samuel in the temple. Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. But hearing is one thing, doing is another. And what Christ wants from us is a full commitment and not some half-hearted compromise. I've been down that track and I know it doesn't work. But yes, you're probably thinking commitment is so much easier to talk about than to put into practice. And forgive me if I talk personally just for a couple of minutes. As I said at the start, in my last 2 years at school, I made some decisions about my life, and they materially affected my life. One, as I said earlier, was that I wanted to be a soldier, and I became a soldier. And the second was that I wanted to follow Christ, and I made a decision to try to do just that. But as I've already said, it was a much easier thing to say than to do. And if I'm being honest, I was a pretty unsatisfactory Christian, too often compromising at what I believed in and not living up to the standards that Christ had set. To use the obvious analogy, I was a very half-hearted Christian soldier. Now, I knew that the way that I was living my life was wrong, and that to be effective for Christ, I had to let him have complete control of my life. But it was too difficult, or so I thought, until one day, 8 years after I joined the army, and just 6 months after I was married, I had a major stroke. I was completely paralysed down one side and carted off to hospital with blue lights flashing. As I said earlier, I was stationed in Berlin at the time, and the German consultant at the main hospital there, trying to be helpful, said to my wife that night, "It is how you say in England, 50-50, we win some, we lose some." Well, the shock of that really concentrated my mind, because at the point that I thought I might lose my life, I realised how much I'd wasted of it up to that point. But as I gradually recovered, my thoughts kept taking me back to my relationship with God, and I realised then how half-hearted I'd been. As I thought things through, I realised there had been several occasions in the past that God had challenged me about my half-hearted commitment to him. I remembered that day in 1973, I already mentioned, towards the end of this particularly violent and difficult day in Belfast, when two gunmen later in the day outflanked the temporary position I'd taken up as my platoon command position and opened fire. And what seemed like a hail of bullets leapt down the street. The corporal on my left, Corporal Howell, who I was in the process of briefing, fell with a bullet in the chest, and my driver, Private Tapper Hall, who was kneeling down beside the vehicle acting as a sentry, was hit in the back. And Later, tragically, very sadly, he died. When I got back to barracks that night, after the operation was over, many conflicting thoughts and emotions crowded in, but one kept recurring. Had I just been very lucky, or was someone trying to say something to me? Should I perhaps take advantage of my fortunate escape and perhaps sort out my relationship with God? But after a while, I just shrugged it all off. Days, weeks and months went by until some 2 years later, this time operating from Crossmaglen in the border area of South Armagh in Northern Ireland, my company was carrying out an operation to neutralise a large improvised explosive device near a crossroads. My company commander, Peter Willis, and I moved forward with the bomb disposal team to show them what we thought was a safe vantage point for them to start their clearance operation. As we moved forward, Peter Willis stopped me and gave me an air photograph, telling me to stay where I was and study it in preparation for another operation in that area that weekend. He and the others went on. They'd only gone another 30 yards or so when some half a minute later there was a tremendous explosion, and I looked up through the clouds of dust and falling debris to see that all four had been instantly killed. Again, that night back in Crossmaglen police station, I wondered, had I just been lucky, or was this another chance to get sorted out with God? But as in the way of a young man, after a while, I just shrugged all that off too. But then those 2 years later in Berlin, I couldn't shrug anything off. It was me this time who was paralysed, frightened, frankly, and unable to speak or move, or indeed shrug anything off. But as I lay in bed in hospital, I found myself in the unusual position of being a spectator on life, unable to move, but with plenty of time to think. And I received many letters from friends, one from an elderly retired major who'd lived near us at home in Norfolk. Some of you might remember Major Bill Batt of Gresham. An amazing man, monster of a man, but an amazing man. He suggested that I looked at Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 and 6, and then later to look at verse 11, which I did. The first two verses read like this: "My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor lose courage when you are punished by him. For the Lord disciplines him whom he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives." To start with, if I'm honest, I was a little bit irritated by that. But I gradually realised that having decided earlier in my life that I wanted to try to follow Christ, God had accepted me then as a son. However, in the intervening years, I'd often let him down, and I'd compromised what I professed to believe in. And then, as invited, I turned to verse 11. "For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. Later, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." Now, as it happened, the day that I was taken ill was the 11th of November 1977. And we all remember that the 11th of November each year is the anniversary of Armistice Day, when at the 11th hour of the 11th month, the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the surrender of Germany to end the First World War was announced. But a surrender is two things. It's the end of the fighting, and it's the beginning of the peace. After years of fighting with my Creator, compromising and ignoring his challenges, I found that a far better way of life was to commit myself wholeheartedly to him, to surrender my will to his will, and thereby gain the peace and purpose in life that only complete trust in Jesus Christ can give. But obedience and commitment are not enough unless transformed by the enabling power of the Holy Spirit. One of my favourite passages in the Bible is the closing verses of John's Gospel, chapter 14, especially verse 27. "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you." And to me this verse helps make real sense of the turbulent times in which we live. But that passage from John 14 also contains these words: "These things I have spoken to you while I am still with you. But the Counselor, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you." And here Jesus is saying that the Father will send the Holy Spirit to those who are prepared to be obedient to God, committed to Christ, and prepared to be open to the Holy Spirit. Because the Father wants us to use the abilities that we've been given to work to bring peace to the lives of individuals, whether we're doing so as a leader at the strategic or operational levels, or as a fighter at the tactical level. The Holy Spirit will guide, direct, and inspire us if only we are open to him. And these three aspects, obedience to God, commitment to Christ, and openness to the Holy Spirit, I think are also like the three interlocking balls of another Venn diagram. But the centre section is still blank. And I firmly believe that the focus that makes sense of all this is the cross of Christ. And to be truly effective as a leader or a foot soldier, the cross must be at the centre of our lives. Leaning at the foot of the cross, of Christ's cross, is the recruiting office where our spiritual journey and duty begins. This is where our spiritual pilgrimage is focused and where the real challenge of spiritual warfare begins. Because Jesus lived as the perfect man, died on the cross taking the weight of our sin on his shoulders, but rose again, breaking the power of death and guilt and sin. And in so doing, he charted the path to peace, everlasting peace, peace with justice for those who believe and trust in him. It's my experience that an encounter with the person of Jesus Christ at the cross changes lives. It can change individuals, and it can have a strategic effect, not only on individuals, but through individuals, on the lives of communities and on the lives of nations. And the cross also brings peace, God's peace, to those who are prepared to meet Christ on the cross and surrender their lives to him and say, not my will, but thy will for my life. So, time has gone. Let me try and pull these thoughts together. Leadership in turbulent times, faith in action. There are traditional ways of understanding and developing leadership. The qualities approach and the functional approach are but two. But in today's more complex environment, in both the business space and the battle space, I believe there needs to be more. I contend the leader needs to analyse very carefully at any moment in time what he or she is trying to do and at what level of leadership. The strategic, the operational, and the tactical levels make different demands on the leader, and he needs to know this and understand the difference. But what really gives the leader his authority, his right to lead, does at the end of the day come down to him or her as a person. It's the nature of their character and the degree of their integrity. This is very different from some media-enhanced image. As far as I'm concerned, character defines the person and answers the question as to whether this is someone to emulate or to follow, and with what enthusiasm. Moreover, integrity establishes the moral baseline to lead. Is this someone who can be trusted? Is this someone whose instructions are honourable? Is this someone to commit to? Do they really have legitimate interests at heart? Or is this person simply a self-seeker or purely interested in the bottom line? Because these are all judgments for the subordinates, the employees, the followers, the voters to make. And their judgments, I submit, will ultimately define success or failure in the enterprise. Perhaps not in the short term, but most certainly in the long to medium term. So the onus is on the leader. The employees, the subordinates, the followers, the voters, in these turbulent times, may increasingly turn to him or her and ask, what do we do now? He or she may understand leadership theories. He or she may have embraced core values that provide a sound moral baseline. But is that enough? It's my experience that without a spiritual dimension to one's life and leadership, there is something major lacking. It's up to each of us to work out what that spiritual dimension is for ourselves on a personal basis. But it is what or who that is in our hearts that will direct what we do with our heads and with our strength in these turbulent times when leadership is most definitely required. It's my experience that a life which is obedient to God, committed to Christ, and open to the Holy Spirit sustains and guides in these turbulent times. But there's no getting away from it. Leading such a life comes at a cost. Remember Christ's words in Mark 8, verse 34. If any man would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. There is no doubt that there is a cost to following Christ today. Such a path is countercultural to many in our increasingly secular society. But if that cost does seem daunting, then remember too the promise of God in Revelation 2, verse 10. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Now that is really worth having in these turbulent times. Thank you for listening so attentively. Thank you.
Richard, would you thank you for coming and coming through the fog to get to us this morning. It's normally fog here, isn't it? And finding around, but it's the other way around this morning. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing so much from the heart, as well as the profound leadership skills. I wish I'd had them when I began as a vicar to know how to lead more effectively. But thank you very much. We have time for a couple of questions, and then I need to get Richard back to his car by 10 o'clock. Otherwise, we might have a ticket slapped on it. Or something. So if you have a couple of questions, please do say. Yes, John.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. You've broken it into 4 decades. The first decade you were time in Northern Ireland. With regards to Northern Ireland, you spoke recently on Radio 4's Today programme about the role of maintaining the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom. So I wondered what your thoughts were on the fact that the withdrawal agreement has effectively placed a border in the Irish Sea, thereby compromising that territorial integrity. And as a military leader and as a Christian, I wonder what your thoughts are on the fact that a government minister has stood on the floor of the House of Commons and said that in order to work a way around this particular situation, we as a country are prepared to break international law.
Well, thank you for that very straightforward and simple question. I didn't sign up for the Today programme this morning, but no, you raised some very important issues there. Just to try and take a little bit one at a time. Northern Ireland is an integral part of the United Kingdom, one of the 4 parts of the United Kingdom. I mean, that's why I spent virtually every year in the 1970s in the province carrying out the operations we were required to carry out to make sure that insurgents, the IRA in the main, did not prevail and win the campaign, if you like, which would have taken Northern Ireland out of the United Kingdom, seeing Northern Ireland join with the Republic into a united Ireland. And I think we did over 38 years. And I know Joe Biden said he wanted to stop the forever war for 20 years. Well, come on, we did 38 years in Northern Ireland. We eventually got there, and Northern Ireland is a much more peaceable place today, and that is good as the peace process continues. I mean, you put your finger then on the other difficult issue. The people of this country voted to leave the European Union. You can't change the geography of history, if you like. Ireland is divided. The Republic is in the European Union. Northern Ireland is not. Somehow you've got to square that particular circle. It's very difficult. It's intractable. It probably has challenged some people's integrity, and you're right to suggest that maybe something has been suggested that we're certainly not comfortable with and may well not be right. But life isn't as simple as on the one hand, on the other hand. There has to be a degree of compromise in politics in order to do the least worst thing for the greater majority. And that, I think, stands somewhat in contrast to what I was saying just now, that I think there are absolutes in our personal life, that we believe in these things and we're going to hold to those things and we're going to reject those things. In the reality of the fallen world, if you like, in which we live, there probably has to be some compromise in order to rub along together. Life is not perfect. We just have to make the best of the imperfections. But from a personal point of view, your personal integrity, your personal beliefs, your personal values actually are more important. It can be quite challenging at times, but that's what's really important.
Perhaps one more question, if there is one. I'm sorry, gentleman behind you, John.
Yes, I echo colleagues' thoughts. Thank you very much indeed. As you were speaking, I was wondering, how do you have the religious belief, the learning, the integrity that you developed, that you eloquently described in your later life, when you first started out in your army? Would that have affected, do you think, the path that you carved to becoming a successful leader throughout your life?
No, I think that's a very good question. I think the answer is that, and I did describe something of a sort of personal development from sort of in my head believing something before in my heart believing it rather more. But I think if you work out for yourself what is really important and you believe in yourself and you believe what is important and you live according to the standards that you set yourself and the values you've identified for yourself, I think reasonable people will respect that and respect you for the way that you're endeavouring to lead your life. Someone who is outwardly a Christian and perhaps wears it too much on their sleeve may well come in for a degree of criticism in any walk of life, may well come for fierce criticism within the army, but actually coming under pressure like that actually can bring the best out in you and should give you greater confidence to continue to stand and to live and to work by the values you've set for yourself. And I think people will see that and they will respect that over time. And I certainly found some of the pressure when I was a younger officer, but subsequently you take on board what you've worked out for yourself as important, and that defines who you are, defines your character. I think it actually, in terms of integrity, it strengthens your personal integrity, and people can see that. In my later part of my career, there were things that the government were asking us to do, which not in theory, in practice we were prepared to do, but the issue was we hadn't got the resources to do it properly. So, I was challenged to get on and continue the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan while making a very robust case to the government, who didn't always listen, that, we'll do what you want us to do, but give us the resources, give us the equipment, give us the money to do the stuff. That's challenging. But if you believe that's the right thing to do, then that's what you must do. So at the end of the day, it's what you believe actually drives who you are and what you do, and I think people will respect you for that if they can see that you are someone of integrity. And I think integrity is a really important part of life.
I think we need to call it a day. I'm so sorry, but because of the car park attendants and all that, but we ought to just give Richard another thanks, and we are so grateful for you coming all the way from Southampton. He has a date with his mother-in-law later, I gather, and then football, isn't it?